Do we have any examples of what good looks like in terms of British kelp forests?
In 2021, Sussex IFCA, Inshore Fisheries and Conservation, imposed a local bylaw which meant that trawling was banned over 300 square kilometres. What we really need for Sussex, for example, actually for Britain, is a new legal system, a complete change in paradigm. Instead of humans being on top of this rights-based chain where we can abuse all other species and our ecosystems for our own utilities and uses, is this idea of rights of nature.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Blue Pioneers podcast. Today I'm going to be speaking with three scientists from the University of Sussex who are part of the Sussex Kelp Recovery Project, which is looking at the recovery of the ecosystem along the coast of Sussex following a trawling ban in 2021. Perhaps each of you could just briefly introduce yourselves and your roles and a little bit about your backgrounds.
I'll start, I suppose I'll jump in. So my name's Mika Peck. I'm a professor of conservation ecology here at the University of Sussex. And I live by the sea. I live right on shore and by sea, and a very deep connection, I suppose, with water. I love water and the sea and nature in general. But I'm going to pass you over to Alice.
I'm Alice, and I'm Mika's PhD student. And my PhD research looks at monitoring biodiversity along the Sussex coast. Valentina?
Hi everyone, I'm Valentina Scarponi. I'm a lecturer at the University of Sussex, so one of Mika's colleagues. And I've also been really lucky to co-lead the kelp restoration project with Mika. So I've been working really closely with Mika and Alice on the project. And just like as Mika was saying, I've also always loved the ocean. I've been a trained marine biologist from day one, and just been really, really excited to be part of this awesome project.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. And perhaps we can start with you, Mika. You say you live and know very well this piece of coastline. It's a piece of coastline that not everybody will be familiar with, actually. So perhaps could you just start by maybe painting a bit of a picture of what this coastline is and what it has the potential to be?
Yeah, I mean, the Sussex coastline, the bit that we're sort of interested in runs from Selsey Bill, which is just near Portsmouth, really, a little bit east of Portsmouth. And, well, ours goes to just about Shoreham, where I live. That's the main area of interest, because historically, that whole area used to be covered by very thick kelp beds. So before 1987, and I'll come to what happened after sort of 1987. Before 1987, you'd have kelp beds that extended kilometres or miles out to sea. I mean, they used to be a real pest. Everyone in the sort of 80s, they were the councils, the local people were complaining about them because you get storms, all the kelp would wash up on the beach, it would smell, there'd be flies. But of course, all that biomass and those flies used to feed, like in the autumn storms, used to feed migratory birds heading to Africa. So they were a really important part of the ecosystem, all that smelly stuff as well. I mean, so these kelp beds used to be basically the birthing grounds and the nursery grounds for all the little fish, the bream, the bass, and all sorts of things along the coast here. And it used to be very, very sort of rich fisheries around here. But so what's happened in 1987, there was a very big storm. I don't know if you remember the hurricane. Some of you are old enough. Some of you, I'm old enough. I was actually studying at Sussex University, very interestingly, that very year, just arrived. And I slept through the whole thing, woke up in the morning, and all the trees had been flattened. And at the same time, what had happened was that a lot of that kelp had got eroded away by the huge waves that were generated by that storm. So since then, it's been disappearing. And one of the big problems appears to be bottom trawling as well. So that was implicated as one of the reasons why the kelp couldn't return or recover, and actually part for its ongoing degradation. So bottom trawling, for those of you who don't know, is one of the most destructive fishing types. It's where you basically drag so a net along the bottom of the sea, and you scoop up everything that's there. And you can only just imagine the damage it causes to the bottom of the seabed, where everything's growing as well. And for that reason, you've lost all the kelp since then. We're down to a few percentage. We've got some very small sites where we can still go to and see sort of kelp as it used to be. And then what it means is that species like the cuttlefish or any of the fish species, they can't lay their eggs on the sea on anything or any sort of substrate. So they've lost all that. They've lost their sort of nesting, egg-laying grounds. And then the safe areas inside the kelp would have been like a very complicated matrix to keep predators out. They could hide away. Like a coral reef it's the coral reef of the temperate sea, let's be honest, the kelp forests. So it was a real sort of disaster for the fisheries and for all sorts of, other reasons, really, that the loss of those beds in 87 and the ongoing sort of human pressures that meant they couldn't recover.
It's quite an interesting shift where I guess the fisheries in the short term would have felt like it was great that the kelp had gone so that they could go and do the trawling, but actually in the long term, it adds to the sort of downturn of the fisheries. And a lot of what it feels like we're seeing now are efforts to really sort of try and turn that around and bring back the ecosystem so that we can actually increase the fisheries. Do you see that sort of mindset shift happening among the fishing community and those who are sort of on that side of it?
I mean, yeah, I don't really want to necessarily speak for the fishing community because it's such a diverse community. I think lumping them together is quite complicated. You've got many people who are very, pro the restoration of the kelp because they're pot fishermen or line fishermen, and they know that increase. And of course, it affects the trawler industry. Any sort of legislation. So I suppose I should say in 2021, Sussex IFCA, Inshore Fisheries and Conservation, imposed a local bylaw which meant that trawling was banned over 300 square kilometres of it, where the kelp beds were historically were. And I suppose it's that ban that obviously causes conflict. It's not an easy thing to put into place because it's affecting livelihoods of fishers. So some fishermen are obviously still probably upset about the whole situation. It did affect their livelihoods. But there are others, who are hoping that the recovery means that they'll get better line fishing, sports fishing, potting and crabbing and so forth. So it's hard to say. But generally, it's been interesting. A lot of the fishermen, there's a number of documentaries been made recently because a lot of the fishermen have actually said they do support it. They've seen what happened over the years. Then they feel, and a number of communities have said that we were guilty in this process of causing this destruction. So yeah, it's something that's an awareness that's growing. But I mean, the public pressure to get this banning was quite high. I don't know if any of you guys have got any thoughts or comments on it, Valentina.
I mean, part of the part of IFCA's work is also to engage with the stakeholders, with the community. So every time they propose like change in the legislation, like for example the trawling bylaw, or also other protection that is going on at the moment, they will go through a series of events with engaging with the community, engaging with the stakeholders, in order to then eventually have the legislation approved. So being such a great part of the process, I think it shows that for it to become a thing, for it to actually being approved, there has been quite a lot of support from the various stakeholders that are involved in the area. So some of them obviously being fishers.
Yeah, it seems to me like this is such almost a flagship project for the way that it's brought together so many different stakeholders to try to just reimagine our sort of use of this piece of seashore and the way in which we value it. You guys obviously are from the sort of scientific, academic side of things. Who else is involved then? You've mentioned the IFCAs, the Inland Fisheries Organisation. Who else needs to be part of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big challenge to getting sort of something so big in place. And it is a big deal. I mean, this is one of the first experiments really with the trawl exclusion zone to see if it allows recovery, removing a human pressure, and to see if nature can make its own natural recovery in the first stages anyway. It did involve, there was an interesting sort of angle to this, because what happened was the Sussex Kelp Recovery Project was put together by Sussex Wildlife Trust, who brought on partners, Blue Wave, who made a lot of films and media, and during the period when they were trying to get this legislation through. So it raised public awareness, and there's a groundswell of public support for this bylaw, which was generated by really the synergies between a number of different sort of, I suppose, conservation organisations, media organisations, and so forth, and academics as well, who were putting that information together. So, it was a big push. It was a big push, and I think there's an urgent need in a way. What it did, it meant people engaged with the process. David Attenborough contributed by doing a voiceover on one of the films that I think that was a huge victory and a huge push to it at the time. This would be pre-2021. So you do need to get this sort of groundswell happening. You need to involve a whole load of multidisciplinary approaches, and bottom-up approaches as well. And you realise that it takes quite a lot of organising sometimes. So it's doable, but it does involve having lots of people engaging, I think.
Yeah, that storytelling piece is so huge. And I think as scientists, we've not always done the best job at sort of telling the stories that engage people beyond the scientific communities that we're sort of all part of. It's one of the things we're really trying to contribute to through our rowing expedition as well, and so this conversation is part of that. But yeah, anything that can bring on David Attenborough is a big coup for getting the word out and getting support. So to come to the scientific side of things, Alice, your PhD is about monitoring the recovery of this ecosystem. Is that right? Can you just explain a little bit about what you're doing and the technologies that you're using?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, speaking of David Attenborough, it was after seeing that video that I applied for the PhD, so it definitely can have a big impact. But yeah, so we've been monitoring biodiversity along the Sussex coast for the last 3 years now, using 2 different biomonitoring techniques. One of them is environmental DNA, and we get a lot of help from Naturemetrics doing that. And the other one is video surveys. So we put down big metal structures called Profs, which stands for Baited Remote Underwater Videos. They have GoPros attached to them, and we put them at different sites along the coast to film the seabed for an hour at a time. And so then we'll go through those videos, identify the species, and compare those to those detected with the environmental DNA.
What sort of communities of species have you got down there? Is there anything that you found particularly interesting or surprising? Is there much there at the moment?
I think there's more there than most people would expect. So in our last study that we just published, we found there were 81 different marine vertebrate species in the area. So that's mostly fish and dolphins. But yeah, so I think the most interesting ones are probably those key species that everybody loves, like the sharks and the rays, and kind of the bigger, more interesting ones. But there are loads of really beautiful, smaller ones as well, like the cuttlefish.
It's worth saying we also identified, which is getting rarer these days, sadly rare, is the European eel, wasn't it? That was one that was picked up with the eDNA samples, you know. So, and these things are really struggling. It was quite interesting. The news piece said, 80 X species found, but actually that's a sad, degraded ecosystem. You know, it's funny how people are still surprised that there's anything there. Maybe, I don't know, you know.
And the fact that it was the rare shark and the rare eel that made the headlines, but actually it's quite sad that they're rare because they probably weren't 40 years ago.
Yeah, it's such an interesting one to try and sort of tell that story in a way that captures the fact that actually we have so much that's there that needs protecting and that we still can protect, but also we could do so much better, and we know how to do it. And it's not rocket science, but it takes sort of like you explained, it takes so many different people to sort of come together and change systems to really be able to bring it about. So have you got to the point yet where you can see any change since the initial baseline, or are we still waiting to see that?
I think it's still too early to properly see change. Ecosystems usually take closer to, a couple of decades to fully recover. So from our data so far, we're not seeing a massive change. Some years there's a slight shift in community composition, probably based on the amount of seaweed growing back each year, but seaweed can be quite cyclical. So I think as well, that's why we need a longer period of time to properly see how the biodiversity is changing. But we have...
So are you seeing seaweed come back then?
Some years, yeah, it's denser than others, but it's up and down. And I think it varies with seawater temperature, pollution as well, probably.
Well, I mean, it's interesting to think that kelp is quite different to sort of obviously the annual seaweeds. I mean, that's the big difference between the kelp. That some of the species of kelp, actually, when they establish, they last for many, many years. And that's the thing. So during the hard winter storms, they're still there, but most of the seaweed kind of disappears as a cycle. And it's not as effective in terms of maintaining the biodiversity. So we haven't seen the kelp necessarily get back as quickly as we'd imagine, probably hope for, let's put it that way, rather than imagine, because I think it's quite a process. We also, one of my other PhD students, Marianne, is developing an ecotoxicology test here at the University of Sussex for kelp. So at a very early stage, when you have these tiny little sporophytes that actually look like little human sperms, and we're using sperm counting techniques to like look at the effect on them, in the same. But those are very fragile stages that you don't imagine that kelp's a very strange organism, and these things are finding it hard to probably find a place to settle on the seabed because the seabed's changed a lot now. It's very sandy and dynamic. So I think there's going to be lots of stages before we get recovery. And one of the anecdotal things is that lots of mussel beds are recovering, which is kind of stabilizing the bottom, which may be the pioneer or the first stage. And then on that, things start to grow. And so, we're actually learning how things naturally recover or do not recover, under these circumstances.
I think also it's important to remember that the ecosystem might not recover to the same state it was at back in the 80s. It actually probably won't because so many other things have changed, but it might still become more biodiverse than it was when the trawling was at its highest.
I mean, we've got climate change to contend with. We've got a major issue is climate change, and we are seeing increasing temperatures year on year here. I think whether that's, it's an El Nino year, particularly today. The coral reefs are getting hammered in Southeast Asia, where we're going to do some work as well in a couple of weeks. But it's it'll be interesting to see what happens. I mean, we've got. And like I say, anything would be better than to have this being hammered by very, powerful human pressures. I think, we've got to remove human pressure from ecosystems to give it a chance in what's facing it in the next few years and decades, really.
So actually, one thing I was going to ask, so you mentioned about that it may not get back to its pre-1987 state. How do we know what that was? Like, do we have any examples of what good looks like in terms of British kelp forests?
I think that's one of the issues. It's hard to find the actual baseline because there isn't data available from back then, or not as comprehensive data as what we're collecting now. There is some trawling data that dates back to the late 80s, so just a little bit later than what I'd like it to, but I'm looking at that to see if we can find a baseline of the biodiversity that was present. We're not going to have as many variables looking at the amount of seaweed and all that. I think some people have recreated the kelp density at different areas along Sussex Bay, but I'm not sure where that data's come from. We're able to more or less reconstruct what it might have looked like, but it will be difficult to know what it was exactly like.
There's an interesting study. One of the students master students did a few years ago, where there is some sort of the annual trawling data that goes back a long way to almost the beginning of the 1900s. We did a little analysis on trophic level. So trophic level is like the higher the predator you are, the bit higher your trophic level. And we're trying to analyze that over time. And we saw a steady decline in the average trophic level over the years. This is as fisheries come. But during the wars, because they couldn't fish, it suddenly jumped up again. So you can see that nature we've been hammering it for many, many years. And sadly, to be honest with you, I mean, Britain is one of the most nature-depleted nations around, sadly. But it has the opportunity to recover, I think. And we do have some information on that.
Within relatively short timeframes, then, if you can see that just within the, removing the pressures from the length of time of the world wars, it means that with it, so you said you've got 5 years of this trawling ban, which is a similar length of time, I guess, to the time over which you saw those impacts previously. Yeah, it'll be fascinating over the next few years to see whether we do see those increases. Are there any good kelp forests left around the UK?
I think up in Scotland there's more kelp, and in Cornwall as well, there's quite a lot.
The weird thing is, actually, if you go towards Devon, I mean, we used them as a comparison site at the beginning. The kelp forests are healthy. The substrate's a bit different. It's a bit more rocky there as well. I don't think it had the trawling pressure because they couldn't get the trawling systems in there, for example. But there's also weird things when you go over towards Kent and get Dover, you've then got kelp again. So there's something odd going on, really in this zone, this particular zone. So that's why we're also exploring other potential things like, is there something coming out of the rivers? Is there some historical ecotoxicological effect of something in this area as well? We're not sure what's stopping the recovery completely. It could be that there's been a massive ecosystem shift and you've got this really weird state now. It's going to take a longer time to recover. And that could be, that's quite rational, but it could be other factors as well. I mean, our use of our waterways, our UK river systems that pour into this, as you well know, I mean, anyone looking at the press, we realise that they're being very badly treated as well. And there's a lot of pollution coming out of the river systems. So we've got a lot to do to address the multiple factors hitting this particular system. And you said, I mean, the recovery was quite in the Second World War, but that was over a whole area. Fishing pressure was removed over a large area. We're only removing it over really 300 square kilometres, which sounds good, but still not that big,
Are the learnings that you're getting from watching how the ecosystem changes naturally, would that feed into efforts to do more active restoration, either here or in other places? Is that part of the plan?
Maybe by the end of the PhD, we'll see how much the ecosystem has recovered or not since the beginning of the trawling ban. And then we'll think about active restoration and what that would look like.
I mean, it all sounds great in principle, I think, but because of so much that is going on, even making plans for active restoration, it needs to be well thought out, because everything, as soon as you start trying to do a new project, anything, obviously it also requires quite a lot of funding. So before inputting lots of funding into something and control as much of the possible things that could potentially go wrong. So in a way, if, kelp is one aspect, trawling is one aspect of it, there's obviously the aspect of pollution. So there could be much more that is going on. So even just, doing some active restoration in the area might still not be the answer. We still have to work with nature rather than imposing our own idea of what is healthy, what could be healthy, what was healthy before. So I think that also has to be thought out at first before even going down that route, which doesn't mean it's not the answer, but I think it's a little bit too early, I think, to think of it as being the answer for now, at least.
Yeah, one of the things that comes up for me a lot in my sort of day job is just the complexity of nature is something that is so easy to sort of underestimate. Ecosystems are complex themselves. There's so many different ecosystems that work in different ways and that are subject to so many sort of different multiple pressures and stresses that there aren't simple solutions, but there are, we have this intrinsic ability of nature to bounce back given a chance. So to me, one of the things that gives me hope in sort of talking to all of these projects, some of which are active restoration, some of which are protection, some of which are sort of, legal changes and sustainable use, just feels like we're trying a diversity of things now to relieve different pressures and to help bring back recovery. And hopefully through all of that, we're sort of collectively learning a lot about sort of what might work or how we can give nature a helping hand to recover. So our crew is called Sea Change. We're sort of all about that systems change, mindset shift, sort of paradigm shift. What's the sea change that you are working towards? And that's, potentially as individuals, not necessarily as a group. But really interested to hear your perspectives on what are the paradigm shifts that we can achieve?
Valentina, do you want to kick off, and we'll maybe have a word each or have a thought each? And
yeah, happy to have a thought each. I mean, personally for me, I do love to talk about what we're doing. I do love talking about, diving and going out on the boat and sharing it with all my friends. And surprisingly enough, even in the life of an academic, I do have friends outside of academia as well. Not very many, but a few. And it is almost it breaks my heart to hear sometimes the misconception about the ocean and the fear of that. Some people still have. Some of my friends wouldn't even put a toe into the sea because they're so terrified that there's going to be this monstrous thing that comes and eat them. Talking to people, being involved in the project, talking with the public, but also training students, and so that they can also go and explain to their friends what it actually is, that they're that how important the ocean is and how much we should respect it and learn to love it. How that hopefully is going to make a change over time for for an ocean that it is healthier, that it is nicer, and then more and more people can actually get to enjoy it, just like we're very lucky to be able to do.
I think mine's very similar to Valentina. I think seeing people's awareness change about how the biodiversity present locally in our seas, and also how our actions then affect those species. I think from all the media attention we had last week on the paper we published saying there were 81 species in Sussex, so many people were really surprised about that. And hopefully that will influence people to, like Valentina said, respect the sea and look after our ecosystems a bit more.
You're actually just on that data set. The ones that I always love are, sure, it's exciting to find, the sharks and rays and things, but it's actually the little fish that no one's ever heard of that are like crazy looking little things and really beautiful, and they're here all around us and nobody even knows that they exist. So of course we don't sort of value them or protect them or anything. But there's things like the lumpfish that just I always think are so cool, and I wish that everybody knew about them. And they've got some great PR opportunities, I think, for some of those little critters.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'd like to say only maybe about 7 years ago when I first dived off my shore. I engaged in the sea a lot there, but first did the scuba diving. And I was actually blown away by what I saw. My first time I dived off the Sussex coast. I'd been diving in coral reef systems, and obviously they're amazing. But I was surprisingly impressed by that. What I'd really like to hope is there's a change in human sort of relationship to nature. And what I tend to see is this, I suppose that people call it the nature deficit disorder, NDD, people are talking about. I mean, that's a bit of a pop psychology term, but I think it has some truth, is that we're not engaged with our environments. Many people don't have that opportunity to be engaged in those environments and those ecosystems. I'd say it's a love for those systems that have driven me to become a conservation ecologist. I'm involved in those protection things. What we really need for Sussex, for example, actually for Britain, is a new legal system, a complete change in paradigm. Instead of humans being on top of this rights-based chain where we can abuse all other species and our ecosystems for our own utilities and uses, is this idea of rights of nature. It's a new emerging sort of thing that's happening. About 40 countries now have it in their law. And even in the UK, there's a charter for the rights of the River Ouse that's being put forward at the moment. And what that does, it changes it. It means the river can be represented in law for abuses against it. It's very different to setting safe levels of contaminants in a way what we do by regulation, traditional regulation. My sort of hope, and I'm working with this in Ecuador, where it's in the constitution to protect rainforests, using their rights in court and training communities to collect data. I'd like to see the UK move to that, to having the rights of nature recognised, so that people like you and me, anyone, this is the way the Ecuadorian system works, can stand up and represent nature in court against a polluting industry or an abuse against it, And I think we need that fundamental mind shift that we are nature, we are part of nature. In fact, we are, if we're ecologists and we're conservation ecologists and activists, we are nature defending itself. And just to finish on that one, I think it's worth remembering. The other day, I was just thinking, I was having my shower, and I was part of that hydrological cycle that came from the evaporation from the oceans to the tops. This beautiful clean water came through my system, were passed over my body, and it went to the ocean. I could feel that connection when I started thinking about it, but normally I treat it as a utility. So taking more consideration that, you are part of that system and respecting those critical moments where you engage with it, trying to be less destructive in everything in everyday activities.
Yeah, thank you. I love that idea of the rights of nature, and it's something that it sounded so outlandish a couple of years ago. You think, what? That's never going to take on, but really seeing it getting some traction in parts of the world, and sort of the legal community getting involved in this space and how we can represent nature, I think is really, really exciting development. So what do you wish everybody knew about the ocean, and what can everybody do? What are some everyday things that people can do that can help in driving these paradigm shifts?
Think about what you're using at home, in the shower, in your kitchen sink, but on the street as well. Everything will lead to the oceans eventually. So just try and reduce the amount of things you throw out, pollution, things you use.
It's extremely important for everyone to be a lot more aware, and this is where the researchers come into play, but also people like QCAT that organizes amazing podcasts to try and sharing the message and bridging the gap between the science and the community, so that everyone can understand it. I think there's a lot that can be done every day. We're driving with our purchases and with our money where we invest it in the small things things and in the big things, what resources are used and what kind of fishing gets done. And if there's less demand, then there's also going to be less supply. So that's really important. I do believe that we need this protection. I do believe that we need to protect what we have on our coastline, and for that we need to raise understanding. So I think in some way everything is all connected, and everything is kind of like it's a big circle of conservation in a way.
Also, let's not blame ourselves completely. I think we need to get together. We need to become activists, get informed. We need to become active, because there are big profit motives and big systems in play that are actually damaging that system. I mean, as you saw for the trawler system, the trawler ban, it was, it's a very, very lazy way to fish, if I was to be honest, But we need to get up and become activists. I think we need to get together. And we do need to make some noise as well and demand change, because it's not all in our power as consumers. We quite often feel I think I even feel very disempowered. So I do think it's getting together with groups, maybe engaging in conservation actions with activist groups. I would go as far as to say get involved with Extinction Rebellion. I mean, it's because we need to have a massive sea change. We are in a biodiversity and climate crisis, and it's not something that we've done by half measures now, unfortunately.
A really good example of that sort of power of voting with your money in terms of what you buy. Like 15 years ago, I remember the people in my university class who were vegetarian. They had to work hard to do it, and they got challenged about it by everyone. Was asking, why are you vegetarian? Why would you do that? There's something weird about it. And it's not that you need to get to the point where you've persuaded everybody in the world to become vegetarian, but enough people do it that it creates a business case for the food producers to create vegetarian options. And then that makes it easier for people to make vegetarian choices, and then it becomes more normal. And then almost you get to the point, at least in the circles that I move in now, where people almost look at you more strangely if you choose to eat meat and ask you, like, why, how do you justify that choice? And it's really been interesting just to see how that can, it's still only a very small minority, but that shift is really perceptible over, relatively short time frame. Hopefully we start to see sort of more and more movement in the right direction. Last question for you all on that note, sort of what is it that gives you hope that we are going to crack this?
In my pessimistic mood, I'm not that hopeful we're going to crack it. In my more optimistic mood, I think if we can get this change for the rights of nature and changing our relationship with nature, I think then we've got a chance. So my big hope is the rights of nature. It's the thing that's given me hope in the last few years as a way forward.
I think my hope is kind of reflects on what you were just saying, Kat, how vegetarianism has kind of shifted over these last 15 years and has really increased massively. I'm hoping that those little changes kind of carry on in the whole spectrum of conservation and biodiversity protection, and that with people like us and other researchers sharing this information about the species that exist and what you can do to protect them, that more and more people will be aware of this and change their actions for the better.
And I think that the last piece of the equation that I think is also quite important is that in response to these changes that we're hoping to see and that we're starting to see, is the ability of nature to actually bounce back if we give them the opportunity to. So there is very tangible examples and documented examples that if we leave nature to kind of just do its thing, it will come back. What that comeback looks like, we might just have to adjust a little bit of our expectations, like we've said for the Kelp project, for example. But if we do remove some of the pressures, then nature will manage. Is powerful enough to change for the better. So that's what gives me hope, of just knowing that we do have a powerful ally with us, and if we just understand and if we just leave it a little bit of space, I think we're all going to be benefiting from it, nature and also human beings, in the long term.
Wonderful. That sounds like a perfect way to finish, actually. Thank you so much, everybody, for the time that you've given us today, and also for all of the amazing work that you've been doing over the last few years and continue to do. And are very much looking forward to rowing past your part of the coastline in just a few weeks' time. And we'll make sure we sort of point it out as we go past. But it completely changes the way that we see the coastline as we row past it by sort of knowing the stories of all of the work that's going on around. So our hope is that then we can sort of take other people with us as we go and sort of give them some insights into the parts of the ocean that we're going past and the work that everybody is doing, which you guys are very much a big part of. So thank you very much, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, and really good luck with your rowing. I think it's a brilliant project. It's kind of inspiring people to get out of their comfort zones as well, I hope, and have a look at the world from a different angle. Well done.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Cool.
Thanks. Good luck.
Bye.